At 4:30 p.m. on the 15th of May 1968, a tornado touched down just southwest of Charles City, Iowa. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The sky had been building all day. Temperatures climbed into the upper 70s, humidity thick and sticky. By late morning, the National Weather Service had already noted the potential for severe thunderstorms across northern Iowa. At 12:30 p.m., a severe thunderstorm watch was issued for a broad area including Floyd County. The watch was not unusual. Spring storms were common in the Midwest. What made this day different was the energy in the atmosphere. A strong low-pressure system over the Dakotas was pushing warm, moist air northward while a cold front moved east. The ingredients were aligning for something worse than a typical thunderstorm. At 1:45 p.m., the first signs of trouble appeared on radar. A line of thunderstorms began developing near the Minnesota border. One cell in particular near Mason City showed rapid growth. Meteorologists in Des Moines watched the radar screen. They saw a classic hook echo forming, the signature shape that often indicates rotation. That hook was not yet associated with a tornado on the ground, but it was enough to raise concern. At 2:15 p.m., a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for several counties, including Floyd. The warning mentioned the possibility of large hail and damaging winds. It did not mention a tornado. That was standard procedure at the time. Tornado warnings were still relatively new and rarely issued unless a funnel cloud was actually sighted. The technology existed to detect rotation on radar, but the protocols for public notification were not as robust as they would later become. At 3 p.m., the storm cell that would produce the Charles City tornado was tracking east-northeast at about 35 miles per hour. It crossed into Floyd County near the town of Norris Springs. People in Norris Springs later reported seeing the sky turn an odd greenish color. Some heard a roaring sound like a freight train in the distance. But no funnel was visible yet. The storm continued to intensify. At 3:30 p.m., the radar echo grew sharper. The rotation became more pronounced. In Des Moines, a forecaster decided to call the Floyd County Sheriff's Office. He warned that a tornado could form within the next hour. The sheriff's dispatcher relayed the message to local police and fire departments, but the warning did not reach the general public. There was no emergency broadcast system for tornadoes in the way there is today. Sirens existed in some towns, but they were typically used for civil defense drills or fire calls, not for weather emergencies. Activation required a deliberate decision by local officials, and that decision often depended on someone actually seeing the tornado. At 4 p.m., the storm was approaching Charles City, a small community of about 9,000 people. The downtown area was a typical Midwestern Main Street, brick buildings, a courthouse square, a few factories, and residential neighborhoods spreading outward. Many people were still at work or school. The sky to the southwest had turned a deep charcoal black. A few residents noticed the clouds churning and called the police station. The dispatcher told them a severe thunderstorm was expected and to take cover, but no tornado warning was broadcast. At 4:15 p.m., the storm was less than 10 miles from the city limits. The hook echo on the radar was unmistakable. The forecaster in Des Moines later said that he considered issuing a tornado warning, but the procedure at the time required confirmation of a funnel cloud. He had no confirmation. The nearest storm spotter was in a town to the north, and that spotter had reported only strong winds. The forecaster waited. At 4:25 p.m., the tornado finally touched down on farmland just southwest of Charles City. It was not a small tornado. Initial reports described a wedge, a wide column of debris connecting the cloud base to the ground. The first structures hit were a few farmhouses. They were leveled instantly. Witnesses later said the tornado looked like a black wall moving across the fields, churning up dirt and trees. At 4:28 p.m., the tornado crossed the Cedar River and entered the southern edge of town. The first neighborhood it struck was a residential area along South Main Street. Houses were ripped from their foundations. Cars were tossed into the air. The noise was described as a continuous roar, louder than any thunder. Inside the city, people had very little warning. Some heard the wind and looked out their windows to see debris flying. Others saw the funnel coming and ran to basements. Many did not have time. At 4:31 p.m., the tornado plowed into the downtown business district. The Floyd County Courthouse, a 3-story brick building, was hit hard. The roof was torn off, walls collapsed inward. Across the street, the library lost its entire second floor. The city hall was damaged. Several stores on Main Street were reduced to rubble. A hardware store at the corner of Main and 7th collapsed onto a group of people who had sought shelter in its basement. The storm did not discriminate. It tore through the commercial core, then continued northeast into more residential blocks. At 4:35 p.m., the tornado passed over the Charles City High School. Classes had ended for the day, but there were still students in the building for after-school activities. The gymnasium roof was lifted and thrown. The auditorium was damaged. Students and teachers took cover in hallways and closets. By some miracle, no one at the school was killed, though several were injured. At 4:38 p.m., the tornado left the city limits. It continued northeast for another few miles before lifting back into the clouds. The total time on the ground was approximately 13 minutes. The path was about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile wide. When the storm passed, the silence was sudden. Dust and debris settled over the wreckage. Survivors emerged from basements and bathtubs to find their city unrecognizable. The damage was catastrophic. Of the roughly 900 structures in Charles City, 830 were damaged or destroyed. The business district was a pile of brick and broken glass. Residential streets looked like a war zone with houses flattened, trees snapped, and cars crumpled. The official death toll was 13 people. Over 450 were injured. The property damage was estimated at $30 million, a staggering figure for a town of that size in 1968. What happened in the minutes before the tornado struck is critical to understanding why so many were caught unaware. The National Weather Service office in Des Moines had detected the rotation. The forecaster had alerted the county sheriff. The sheriff had relayed the information to local police. And yet no public warning reached the citizens of Charles City until after the tornado had already hit. The city did have air raid sirens, but they were not activated. Why? The answer lies in a chain of missed signals and assumptions. The police dispatcher, upon receiving the Weather Service call, did not interpret it as an order to sound the sirens. The sirens were under the control of the city fire department, and the fire chief later stated that he had not been told a tornado was imminent. The phone call from the sheriff's office to the police station mentioned the possibility of a tornado, but the language was cautious. It was a forecast, not a confirmed event. Without visual confirmation, the local officials hesitated. In that hesitation, the warning window closed. There were also complications with radar interpretation. The hook echo that the Des Moines forecaster saw was clear, but the technology of the late 1960s was not as advanced as modern Doppler radar. The resolution was lower. It was difficult to determine the exact location of a tornado relative to populated areas without ground truth. The forecaster did not want to issue a false alarm. False alarms were common enough that public trust in warnings was already fragile. But in this case, the caution proved fatal. The aftermath of the Charles City tornado led to significant changes in how tornado warnings were issued and communicated. Investigators from the National Severe Storms Laboratory and the Weather Bureau analyzed the event. They found that the warning system relied too heavily on eyewitness reports. Radar had shown the threat, but there was no standardized protocol for translating radar data into an immediate public alert. The lesson was clear. The technology to detect tornadoes was ahead of the system to warn people. In the years that followed, the Weather Bureau pushed for closer coordination between radar operators and local emergency managers. They encouraged the use of direct telephone lines, standard phrasing for danger messages, and pre-authorization for siren activation without the need for visual confirmation. The Charles City tornado, along with other devastating storms of the late 1960s, helped build the framework for the modern tornado warning system. The question of who was responsible for the missed warning persists in the collective memory of the town. Survivors often ask why the sirens did not sound. The answer is not simple. It was a failure of communication, not a lack of warning. The warning existed, but it did not travel the last mile. The city had no formal emergency operations plan. The sheriff, the police, the fire department, and the weather service each had a piece of the puzzle, but no one assembled it. The forecaster in Des Moines saw the threat. He called the sheriff. The sheriff called the police. The police informed the fire department, but by the time the chain reached its end, the tornado was already tearing through houses. The fire chief later said that he received the warning only minutes before the tornado hit, and by then the sirens would have provided no protection. He decided to use the time to take cover instead. That decision, however questionable, underscores a deeper problem. The system was not designed for speed. The phone calls, the relays, the manual decisions, all of it took time. In a 13-minute tornado, that time was everything. For the people of Charles City, the warning came too late. Some never heard it at all, they only heard the roar. At 4:39 p.m. the roar faded. What remained was a silence punctuated by screams, the hiss of broken gas lines, the drip of water from shattered pipes. Survivors crawled out from under debris. Some walked dazed through streets that no longer existed as streets. The first rescuers were neighbors, family members, people who had been in basements moments earlier. They dug with their hands. They lifted beams. They called out names. Within 10 minutes, the first official responders arrived. Police officers from neighboring towns, volunteer firefighters, and the Iowa National Guard converged on Charles City. The roads were blocked by fallen trees and collapsed buildings. Emergency vehicles had to be guided through fields and around piles of rubble. The Floyd County Courthouse, which had lost its roof, served as a makeshift command center. The injured were taken to the Charles City Hospital, which had also sustained damage but remained operational. Doctors and nurses worked through the night. Many had lost their own homes but stayed at the hospital to treat others. By nightfall, the scope of the disaster was clear. 250 people were hospitalized. Another 200 were treated for minor injuries and released. The dead were not yet all accounted for. As darkness settled, search teams went house to house with flashlights. They called out into collapsed basements, listening for faint responses. One rescuer later described the scene as a graveyard of splintered wood and twisted metal. The smell of natural gas hung in the air. The National Guard sealed off the downtown area. Looters were a concern, but the overwhelming mood was not lawlessness, it was shock. The next morning, May 16th, the sun rose over a city that looked as though it had been bombed. Aerial photographs show a clear path of destruction cutting diagonally through the town. The path was nearly 3 miles long inside city limits. Entire blocks were flattened. The downtown core, once a collection of brick storefronts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a field of rubble. The courthouse stood, but without its dome. The high school gymnasium was gone. The library's second floor was open to the sky. Governor Harold Hughes declared Floyd County a disaster area. He flew over the damage in a National Guard helicopter. Later, he walked the streets and spoke with survivors. He promised state aid. President Lyndon Johnson was notified. The federal government sent representatives from the Office of Emergency Planning, but the real work was done by the people of Charles City themselves. They organized into volunteer crews. They cleared debris. They set up temporary shelters in churches and schools that had escaped major damage. The Red Cross arrived with food, blankets, and medical supplies. Among the stories of loss were stories of improbable survival. A family of 5 huddled in a basement as their house was lifted and thrown. When they emerged, the house was gone, but they were unharmed. A man named Harold R. was working in his garage when the tornado hit. He was thrown into a ditch and buried under a pile of lumber. He dug himself out and walked to his house to find it leveled. His wife and children had taken shelter in the basement. They were alive. Another man, a World War II veteran, later said that the tornado sounded like the artillery barrages he had heard in Europe. He pulled 3 neighbors from a collapsed building. But not everyone could be saved. The official death toll eventually reached 13. Among the deceased were an elderly couple found in the wreckage of their home, a young mother and her infant daughter, a man who had taken shelter in a hardware store basement that collapsed on him. The names were published in the local newspaper, the Charles City Press, in a memorial edition that also served as a call to rebuild. The city held a mass funeral on May 18th. Hundreds attended. The governor spoke. Clergy from multiple denominations led prayers. In the weeks that followed, teams of investigators from the National Severe Storms Laboratory and the Weather Bureau arrived in Charles City. They wanted to understand not just the tornado, but the failure of the warning system. They interviewed every person involved in the chain of communication: the forecaster in Des Moines, the sheriff, the police dispatcher, the fire chief. They also interviewed survivors about what they had heard and when. What they found was a system that worked in theory but broke down in practice. The forecaster had indeed seen the hook echo on radar. He had called the Floyd County Sheriff at approximately 4:15 p.m. The sheriff then called the Charles City Police Department. The police dispatcher, a woman named Evelyn, took the call. She later testified that the sheriff said there was a tornado watch and that a funnel cloud had been reported near Floyd. But the sheriff's own account differed slightly. He said he had reported a tornado sighting, not just a watch. The confusion arose from terminology. A tornado watch meant conditions were favorable. A tornado warning meant a tornado had been sighted or indicated by radar. In 1968, these terms were not as standardized as they are today. The dispatcher believed she was receiving a watch, not a warning. She relayed the information to the fire chief. The fire chief later stated that he understood the message to be a watch. He did not activate the sirens because, in his words, there was no confirmed funnel cloud. He also noted that the sirens were only used for air raids or confirmed tornadoes. The policy, such as it was, required visual confirmation. That confirmation never came from the dispatcher. The sheriff had not told her to sound the sirens. The forecaster had not told the sheriff to sound the sirens. The chain of command had no directive to act. The investigators also examined the radar data. The hook echo was visible at 4:10 p.m., but the radar was not calibrated to show exact ground coordinates. The forecaster estimated the tornado's location based on distance and azimuth from his radar site in Des Moines. That estimate placed the tornado near Charles City, but the margin of error was significant. He could not say for certain that the tornado was on the ground. He could only say that rotation was present. In 1968, radar technology was crude compared to modern Doppler systems. The forecaster was essentially working with a moving image of precipitation intensity. He had no velocity data. He could not see wind speed or direction inside the storm. The hook echo was a strong indicator, but it was not proof. The lack of spotter reports further complicated matters. The nearest trained spotter was in Norris Springs, a town about 10 miles north of Charles City. That spotter reported strong winds and hail but no funnel cloud. The tornado that hit Charles City was rain-wrapped. From a distance, it would have been difficult to see. The spotter in Norris Springs was looking at the same storm but from a different angle. He never saw the funnel because it was hidden behind a curtain of rain. So the forecaster had radar evidence but no ground confirmation. He chose to wait. The questions that investigators asked were blunt. Should a forecaster issue a warning based solely on radar? Should the sheriff have taken action without a direct order? Should the fire chief have sounded the sirens even without a confirmed funnel? The answers, in hindsight, seem obvious. But in 1968, the culture of emergency management was different. Warnings were treated as exceptions, not routine. False alarms eroded trust. The public often ignored warnings that did not materialize. The Weather Bureau had a policy of not issuing tornado warnings without visual confirmation. That policy was about to change. The Charles City tornado was one of several catastrophic storms in the late 1960s that exposed the weaknesses of the warning system. In 1965, the Palm Sunday tornado outbreak in the Midwest killed over 200 people despite advance warnings. In 1970, the Lubbock tornado caused widespread destruction in Texas. Each event brought incremental improvements, but Charles City was especially instructive because the warning had been given to officials but never reached the public. The problem was not detection, it was dissemination. In 1969, the Weather Bureau established the Severe Local Storms Unit, later renamed the Storm Prediction Center. New radar systems were deployed. The WSR-57 radar network was expanded, but its limitations remained. The breakthrough came in the 1970s with the development of Doppler radar, which could measure wind velocity inside storms. That technology would eventually allow forecasters to see rotation directly. But for Charles City, that future was 3 decades away. The human consequences of the missed warning did not end with the recovery. Survivors reported long-term psychological effects. Some could not sleep through thunderstorms. Others developed a hypervigilance to weather reports. Children who had witnessed the destruction grew up with a deep fear of tornadoes. The community itself experienced a kind of collective trauma. But it also experienced a remarkable resilience. Rebuilding began almost immediately. The city formed a long-range planning committee. They decided not just to restore what had been lost, but to improve the city. New building codes were adopted. The downtown was redesigned with wider streets and storm shelters. The high school and library were rebuilt. By 1970, much of the visible damage had been repaired, but the memory remained. Today, Charles City has a tornado siren system that can be activated remotely from the County Emergency Management Office. The sirens are tested regularly. The protocol is clear. If a tornado warning is issued by the National Weather Service, the sirens sound immediately. No visual confirmation is required. That change is a direct result of 1968. The question of whether the deaths in Charles City could have been prevented is unanswerable in a strict sense. The tornado was violent. Even with a warning, some might not have reached shelter in time, but many people who died were in structures that offered no protection. A warning might have driven them to basements or interior rooms. It might have saved lives. The 13 who died were not statistics. They were neighbors, parents, children. Their names are engraved on a memorial in the Charles City Public Library, which itself was rebuilt after the storm. The tornado of May 15, 1968 remains a case study in emergency management. It is taught at meteorology schools and in emergency response training programs. It illustrates the difference between a warning that exists and a warning that is heard. It shows how technology can outpace procedure, and it underscores the human cost of hesitation. In the decades since the National Weather Service has transformed, today warnings are issued with precise geographic polygons. They are disseminated through weather radios, mobile phones, television, and sirens. The average lead time for a tornado warning is now about 15 minutes. That is a significant improvement from the 0 minutes that Charles City received. But the system still relies on the final link in the chain, the person who hears the warning and takes action. The story of Charles City is not just about a tornado. It is about how a community rebuilt itself from rubble, how a flawed system was corrected, and how the memory of a single afternoon reshaped the way an entire nation responds to severe weather. The roar of the tornado has faded, but the lessons have not. They are built into the concrete of every storm shelter, into the code of every emergency siren, into the training of every meteorologist who watches a hook echo on a radar screen and does not wait. On the morning of May 16, 1968, at 6 a.m., the sun rose over a city that no longer looked like itself. The streets that had been lined with elms and maples were now lined with splintered stumps. The houses that had stood for generations were now piles of kindling. The people who had gone to bed the night before in a quiet Iowa town woke to a landscape that resembled a war zone. The first light revealed the full scope of what the tornado had done. The path was measured at 100 yards wide in some places, 400 in others. It had traveled 12 miles through Floyd County, but the worst damage was concentrated in a 20-block area of Charles City. The city's business district was essentially gone. The high school was destroyed, the library was gone, the municipal building was heavily damaged, the hospital had lost its roof, the water tower had collapsed, the railroad tracks were twisted, cars were wrapped around trees, and everywhere there was debris, insulation, shingles, photographs, clothing, pieces of furniture, all of it scattered across the fields. The recovery began before the sun was fully up. Neighbors emerged from basements and ditches. They walked toward the sounds of crying and shouting. There were no official instructions. There was no centralized command. The fire department had survived, but its equipment was damaged. The police department was overwhelmed. The National Guard was not activated until later that morning, so the people of Charles City did what people in disaster zones have always done. They helped each other. They pulled debris off trapped survivors. They carried the injured to makeshift triage stations. They searched for the missing. The first priority was to find those who had not made it to shelter. The death toll, as it turned out, was 13. That number is deceptively small. In a tornado of F5 intensity, a death toll of 13 suggests that many more should have died. The population of Charles City at the time was just over 10,000. The tornado struck at a time when many people were still at work or in transit, but the fact that only 13 died is a testament to the quick thinking of those who did find shelter and to the randomness of tornadoes. Some blocks were completely flattened, yet some of those houses had basements. Other blocks were partially damaged, but the people in them had no warning and no protection. The 13 who died included a woman who was in her living room when the house collapsed, a man who was driving home from work and was thrown from his car, a child who was in a mobile home. The ages ranged from 2 to 78. The injured numbered nearly 500. Many were treated at the hospital, which had lost its roof but still functioned. Doctors performed surgeries in hallways. Nurses worked by flashlight. The hospital was not safe, but there was nowhere else to go. The nearest major hospital was in Mason City, 20 miles away, but the roads were blocked, so the hospital became a field hospital. The injured were triaged by severity. The most critical were evacuated by helicopter later in the day. But for the first hours, the people of Charles City depended on each other. At 7:30 a.m., the first official search and rescue teams arrived from neighboring towns. They brought heavy equipment and trained personnel. The National Guard arrived by 9 a.m. The governor of Iowa declared Floyd County a disaster area. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters. The military provided food, water, and medical supplies. By noon, the immediate rescue phase was largely complete. The focus shifted to recovery, finding the dead, clearing the debris, and assessing the damage. The damage was estimated at $30 million in 1968 dollars, which would be over $200 million today. That figure covered the loss of more than 500 homes, 50 businesses, 5 churches, 2 schools, and the county courthouse. The city's infrastructure, water, sewer, electricity, gas, was entirely destroyed. For days, Charles City had no running water, no power, no telephones. The only communication was through amateur radio operators who set up a makeshift network to relay messages to the outside world. The recovery effort was complicated by the weather. On May 17th, the day after the tornado, a cold front moved through. Temperatures dropped. Rain fell. The debris became muddy and heavy. The search for the final missing person, a woman whose body was buried under a collapsed garage, continued for 2 days. Her body was recovered on May 17th at 4:30 p.m. After that, the death count was final. The investigation into the warning failure began almost immediately. The National Weather Bureau, as it was then called, sent a team to Charles City. The team included meteorologists and communications specialists. They interviewed the forecaster in Des Moines. They interviewed the sheriff. They interviewed the dispatcher. They interviewed the fire chief. They reviewed the radio logs. They reviewed the radar data. What they found was not a single point of failure, but a chain of failures, each link weak enough to break under the weight of the moment. The forecaster, Donald, had seen the hook echo at 4:10 p.m. He had called the sheriff at 4:12 p.m. He had said, "I have a tornado watch for Floyd County. We have a hook echo on radar." The sheriff had interpreted that as a watch, but the forecaster had intended it as a warning. The terminology was not standardized. The Weather Bureau at the time did not have a formal system for issuing tornado warnings based on radar alone. The procedure required visual confirmation. Donald knew that the hook echo was a strong indicator, but he also knew that if he issued a formal warning and it turned out to be a false alarm, he would face criticism. He chose to use the word watch instead. That choice had consequences. The sheriff in turn called the dispatcher. He said, "We have a tornado watch for Floyd County. Notify the fire chief." The dispatcher understood that to mean a watch. She called the fire chief and said, "There is a tornado watch." The fire chief, who was at the fire station, looked outside. The sky was green. The wind was picking up, but he saw no funnel cloud. He did not activate the sirens. He waited. At 4:25 p.m., the wind began to howl. The fire chief looked out the window again. He saw debris flying. He saw trees bending. He realized that a tornado might be coming, but by then it was too late. The sirens were not sounded because the fire chief believed he needed a confirmed sighting. The policy, as he understood it, was clear: sound the sirens only for air raids or confirmed tornadoes. He had no confirmation. He waited. At 4:30 p.m., the tornado struck. The sirens never sounded. The investigation also noted that the sheriff's office had a direct telephone line to the Weather Bureau. That line was not used. The sheriff could have called back to ask for clarification, but he did not. The dispatcher could have asked the fire chief if he needed more information, but she did not. The fire chief could have called the sheriff to ask if a warning had been issued, but he did not. The system failed not because of a single mistake, but because of a series of missed opportunities. The Weather Bureau's own policies were reviewed. After Charles City, the Bureau began to develop criteria for issuing warnings based on radar alone. The term tornado warning was standardized. The word watch was reserved for conditions that were favorable, not for confirmed threats. But the change did not happen overnight. It took years. The 1970 Lubbock tornado and the 1974 super outbreak further accelerated reforms. By the late 1970s, the National Weather Service had a network of Doppler radar sites, and warnings were issued with greater confidence. The human cost of that hesitation is not measured only in the 13 dead. It is measured in the survivors who carry the memory. One survivor, a 16-year-old girl named Linda, was in her family's living room when the tornado hit. She had heard no siren, she had no warning. She grabbed her younger brother and ran to the basement. The house collapsed above them. They were trapped for hours. When they were pulled out, Linda had a broken arm, her brother had a concussion. Their parents were unharmed, but the trauma stayed. Linda would later say that she never heard a thunderstorm again without checking the sky. She never trusted the absence of sirens. Another survivor, a farmer named Harold, lived outside Charles City. He saw the tornado from his field. He knew it was coming. He drove toward town to warn others, but he was too late. He arrived at the edge of the damage zone just as the tornado lifted. He spent the next 3 days helping with the search. He later told a reporter, "I've never been so scared in my life, not of the storm, of what I saw afterward." The rebuilding of Charles City was a project that lasted years. The city adopted a master plan that included new building codes requiring storm shelters in schools and public buildings. The new high school, completed in 1971, had a reinforced basement. The new library had a concrete storm shelter. The city also installed a new siren system with multiple sirens placed throughout the city. The system was designed to be activated remotely from the Floyd County Emergency Management Office. The protocol was simple. If the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning, the sirens would sound. No visual confirmation needed. But the most important change was cultural. The people of Charles City became hyper-aware of weather. They followed forecasts. They listened to ham radios. They watched the sky. The old attitude of "it won't happen here" was replaced by a readiness that persists to this day. Storm drills are held in schools. The community sponsors weather spotter training classes. The county has a network of trained storm spotters who report directly to the National Weather Service. In the decade since 1968, Charles City has not experienced another major tornado. The sirens have sounded many times for warnings, but the storms have passed elsewhere. Some residents say they still feel a chill when the sirens go off. Others say they feel grateful that they live in a city that learned its lesson. The story of the Charles City tornado is not unique. Similar failures occurred in other towns, but the combination of factors, the radar evidence, the unclear communication, the policy gap, the devastating outcome, made it a textbook case. It is studied in meteorology courses. It is analyzed in emergency management seminars. It is cited in reports on the evolution of the warning system. The question that remains is whether anything has truly changed. Today, warning systems are faster and more reliable. The average lead time for a tornado warning is 15 minutes. But that lead time means nothing if the message is not received or not acted upon. In 2011, a tornado struck Joplin, Missouri, killing 161 people. The warnings were issued, but many people did not hear them. Some did not understand the urgency, others hesitated. The same problems that plagued Charles City, communication gaps, lack of public awareness, reliance on technology that is not foolproof, still exist. What happened in Charles City on May 15, 1968 was not just a natural disaster. It was a systemic failure. It was a moment when technology outpaced procedure, when human judgment faltered, and when a chain of small decisions led to a large tragedy. The city's recovery was remarkable, but the memory of that failure has not faded. It is built into the concrete and the code and the training. It is a reminder that warning systems are only as good as the people who use them. The tornado that struck Charles City was a violent, erratic, rain-wrapped storm. It was invisible until it was too late. And the system that should have seen it coming was not ready. That is the lesson. That is why the story still matters. Because every spring when the supercell storms roll across the plains, somewhere a dispatcher takes a call. Somewhere a sheriff makes a decision. Somewhere a fire chief looks at the sky, and the question is not whether the radar can see the hook. The question is whether anyone will act. The roar of the tornado has faded, the city has healed, but the silence that preceded that roar, the silence of the sirens that never sounded, still echoes. It echoes in the training of every meteorologist who watches a hook echo and does not wait. It echoes in the policy of every emergency manager who activates the sirens without hesitation. It echoes in the memory of every survivor who lives through another storm. And it echoes in the hope that the next time the warning will be heard. Yet the echoes did not fade with the rebuilding. They became part of the national conversation about how storms are tracked, how warnings are issued, and how communities prepare. In the months following the Charles City tornado, the Weather Bureau conducted an internal review. It was not a public report, but its findings eventually leaked into meteorological journals and congressional hearings. The review focused on one central question: why did a tornado that appeared on radar for at least 12 minutes result in zero warning to the public? The answer was not simple. The radar operator in Des Moines had seen the hook echo. He had relayed the information, but the chain of communication had broken at every link. The Weather Bureau had no standardized protocol for issuing a warning based solely on radar. The Bureau's own field manual, as of 1968, still treated radar as a supplementary tool. Visual confirmation remained the gold standard. That manual had been written in 1960 before the installation of the WSR-57 radars. By 1968, the technology had advanced, but the procedures had not. The internal review also examined the training of radar operators. The operator in Des Moines had been on the job for less than 2 years. He had received basic training in radar interpretation, but his supervisor had not drilled him on the specific signatures of severe tornadoes. The hook echo was a known pattern, but the operator hesitated to call it a tornado because he had never seen one on radar before. He said later that he thought it might be a false return. He was wrong. Another finding concerned the telephone line between the Floyd County Sheriff's Office and the Des Moines Weather Bureau. That line was supposed to be a direct, dedicated circuit. It had been installed in 1966 as part of a pilot program to improve communication between the Bureau and local law enforcement. But the line was not tested regularly. On the day of the tornado, the sheriff's dispatcher picked up the phone and called the Bureau. She reached the same operator who had seen the hook echo. But she did not ask for a warning. She asked for the time. The operator gave her the time. Then she asked about the weather. The operator said there was a tornado watch. That was all. The missed opportunity was not that the operator failed to say the word warning. It was that the dispatcher did not know what to ask. She had no training in severe weather terminology. She did not know that a hook echo on radar was a definitive sign of a tornado. She did not know that she could request a warning even if the Bureau had not issued one. She assumed the Bureau would tell her if danger was imminent. That assumption was fatal. The fire chief's decision not to sound the sirens was also examined in detail. He testified that he had been instructed to sound sirens only for an air raid or a confirmed tornado. The instruction had come from the city council in 1963 following a false alarm earlier that year. A neighboring town had accidentally activated its sirens during a routine test, causing panic and minor injuries. The city council had passed a resolution requiring visual confirmation. The fire chief followed that resolution to the letter. He did not sound the sirens because he had not seen a funnel cloud. He could not see a funnel cloud because the tornado was rain-wrapped. He did not know that the tornado could be invisible until it was directly overhead. The city council's resolution was never rescinded. It remained in effect until after the tornado. The fire chief later said that if he had known a warning had been issued, he would have sounded the sirens regardless of the resolution. But he did not know a warning had been issued because none was issued. The circular logic trapped everyone. In the wake of the disaster, the Weather Bureau realized that its entire warning philosophy needed to change. The Bureau began a series of experiments with radar-based warnings in the early 1970s. One of the most important was the Joint Doppler Operational Project, which started in 1997 on. This project tested the use of Doppler radar to detect mesocyclones, the rotating updrafts that produce tornadoes. The results were promising. By 1979, the National Weather Service had deployed a prototype network of Doppler radars in the central United States. The Charles City tornado was cited as a primary motivator for the shift, but technology alone could not solve the problem. The human factors remained. In 1973, a tornado struck Delphi, Indiana, killing 5 people. A radar warning was issued, but the local emergency manager did not believe it. He waited for visual confirmation. The tornado struck without sirens. The pattern repeated. Each time a community hesitated, the death toll rose. The National Weather Service responded by developing a standardized warning system. The term tornado warning was defined precisely: an imminent threat based on radar or spotter report with a lead time as short as possible. The term tornado watch was reserved for conditions favorable for development. The Weather Service also established a network of trained storm spotters. These spotters were volunteers who received formal training in identifying funnel clouds, wall clouds, and other signs. Their reports became the visual confirmation that the fire chiefs of the 1960s had lacked. Charles City itself became a model for community recovery. The city's new building codes required storm shelters in all new schools, hospitals, and public buildings. The codes also mandated that all homes built after 1970 include a basement or a reinforced safe room. The city's siren system was redesigned with multiple activation points. The sirens could be triggered from the County Emergency Management Office, the Sheriff's Office, or the fire station. Each activation point had a backup power source. The most important change, however, was cultural. The people of Charles City began to take weather seriously. The local newspaper ran a series of articles on tornado awareness. The school district instituted annual tornado drills. The county sponsored weather spotter training classes. By 1972, Floyd County had over 50 trained spotters, each with a direct line to the Des Moines Weather Service office. The spotter network became a model for other counties in Iowa. Decades later, the lesson of Charles City is still taught. In 2019, the National Weather Service held a conference on the history of tornado warnings. The keynote speaker was a meteorologist who had studied the Charles City event. He showed the hook echo on the radar film. He played the audio of the phone calls. He asked the audience of emergency managers, "If you were the dispatcher in 1968, would you have known what to ask? If you were the sheriff, would you have used the word warning instead of watch? If you were the fire chief, would you have sounded the sirens based on a phone call without seeing the tornado?" The room was silent. The answer for many was no. The skills needed to interpret radar, to communicate urgency, and to act on incomplete information are not innate. They must be taught, they must be practiced, they must be built into the system. Charles City was a lesson in what happens when those skills are absent. In the present day, the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings with an average lead time of 15 minutes. That is a significant improvement from the 0 minutes in 1968, but lead time is meaningless if the public does not respond. Studies after the Joplin tornado in 2011 showed that many people did not take shelter even when they heard the warning. Some did not believe it. Some did not know what to do. Some were waiting for the sound of a siren that never came because they were indoors and could not hear it. The Charles City tornado reminds us that the warning system is a chain. It begins with the radar and the meteorologist. It passes through the communicator and the dispatcher. It reaches the decision maker and the siren. It ends with the person who hears the siren and takes action. Every link must hold. In 1968, the chain broke at multiple points. The technology was good, but the procedures were not. The people were well-meaning, but the training was insufficient. The result was 13 dead in a city that knew a tornado was coming but could not act in time. Today, the sirens in Charles City are tested every Saturday at noon. The city's emergency management office runs drills quarterly. The local schools have shelter plans posted in every classroom. The fire chief no longer waits for confirmation. The protocol is simple. If the National Weather Service issues a tornado warning, the sirens sound. No one asks for visual confirmation. No one checks the city council resolution. The resolution was repealed in 1969, but the echoes of that silent afternoon remain. They are in the storm shelter signs that dot the city. They are in the stories told by grandparents to grandchildren. They are in the quiet reverence that falls over the community when the sky turns green. The tornado of May 15, 1968 did not destroy Charles City. It changed it. It forced a reckoning with how we warn, how we decide, and how we survive. And that reckoning is not over. Every spring, when the supercell storms roll across the plains, the question is still the same. Will the chain hold? The roar of the tornado has faded. The city has healed. But the silence that preceded that roar, the silence of the sirens that never sounded, still echoes. It echoes in the training of every meteorologist who watches a hook echo and does not wait. It echoes in the policy of every emergency manager who activates the sirens without hesitation. It echoes in the memory of every survivor who lives through another storm. And it echoes in the hope that the next time the warning will be heard, because the next time the chain might break again. But if it does, it will not be because we did not learn from Charles City. At dawn on May 16, 1968, the sun rose over a city that no longer looked like itself. The Charles City tornado had carved a path of destruction nearly a mile wide and over 8 miles long. 13 people were dead. More than 400 were injured. Hundreds of homes were gone. The survivors emerged from basements and bathtubs to find their neighborhoods unrecognizable. The silence that followed the storm was not the silence of the sirens. It was the silence of shock. What happened next was not just a recovery. It was an investigation into every decision that had been made in the hours before the tornado struck. The Weather Bureau sent a team to Charles City within days. They interviewed the meteorologist who had issued the watch. They interviewed the dispatcher who had relayed the message. They interviewed the sheriff, the fire chief, the city council members. They collected the radar film, the phone logs, the testimony of witnesses. The goal was not to place blame. The goal was to understand how a community with 26 minutes of warning could fail to warn its own people. The team found a cascade of failures. The first was semantic. The word watch had been used when warning was needed. The dispatcher, trained to follow protocols, repeated the word watch without realizing that the situation had escalated. The second failure was hierarchical. The sheriff deferred to the fire chief because sirens were a fire department responsibility. The fire chief deferred to the city council resolution because he was a by-the-book administrator. The city council had not anticipated a rain-wrapped tornado. The third failure was structural. The siren activation required visual confirmation, but the tornado was invisible until it was directly overhead. By then, it was too late. The investigation concluded that no single person was at fault. The system was the problem. The system was built on assumptions that did not hold in 1968. The assumptions were that tornadoes would be seen, that warnings would be unambiguous, and that decision-makers would have enough time to deliberate. In Charles City, all three assumptions failed. The report was filed. The Weather Bureau began to draft new guidelines, but change comes slowly when it requires rewriting procedures across an entire country. The first major reform came in 1969 when the Bureau officially adopted the term tornado warning as a distinct category from tornado watch. The definition was simple. A warning meant that a tornado had been sighted or indicated by radar, and immediate action was required. A watch meant that conditions were favorable, but no tornado had been confirmed. The distinction was taught to every weather service office in the nation, but the reform did not stop at semantics. The Weather Bureau also recognized that radar interpretation was not being used effectively. In Charles City, the meteorologist had seen the hook echo on radar but had not been trained to translate that observation into an urgent warning. The Bureau began a program to train all meteorologists in radar interpretation. The program included practice with real radar images from past tornadoes. The goal was to build a reflex. See the hook echo, issue the warning. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not ask for a spotter report. The radar was the spotter. The training program was tested almost immediately. On May 11, 1970, a tornado outbreak struck the Texas Panhandle. The Weather Bureau office in Amarillo had a staff member who had attended the new radar training. He saw a hook echo on the radar screen at 4:12 p.m. He issued a tornado warning at 4:13 p.m. The warning reached the local sheriff, who activated the sirens. The tornado touched down at 4:16 p.m. No one was killed. The lead time was 3 minutes. It was not enough to save property, but it was enough to save lives. The difference between Charles City and Amarillo was the difference between waiting for a witness and trusting the machine. By 1972, the Weather Bureau had implemented a national policy for radar-based warnings. The policy required that any hook echo observed on radar automatically trigger a tornado warning. The policy did not allow for exceptions based on visual confirmation. The policy did not defer to local emergency managers. The policy was written to be followed without hesitation. The ghost of Charles City was in every word. The policy worked. In the decade after 1972, the average lead time for tornado warnings increased from 0 minutes to nearly 6 minutes. The death toll from tornadoes in the United States dropped by more than half. The improvements were not entirely due to radar. Better communication, more spotter networks, and public education also played a role. But the foundation was the decision to trust the radar. In Charles City, the survivors watched these changes from a distance. Many of them had lost family members who might have survived if the sirens had sounded. They had to live with the knowledge that a simple change in procedure could have saved their loved ones. The psychological toll was deep. Studies of tornado survivors from other events have shown that post-traumatic stress disorder can last for decades. In Charles City, the trauma was compounded by the knowledge that the disaster was preventable. The city offered counseling services, but the stigma of seeking help in a rural community in the 1960s kept many from using them. It was not until the 1980s that a support group for tornado survivors was formed. The support group met monthly in the basement of the public library. The members talked about the sound of the wind, the sight of the sky turning green, the feeling of being trapped in a bathtub while the world collapsed around them. They talked about the loved ones they had lost and the guilt they felt for surviving. They talked about the sirens that never sounded. The group was small, but it was persistent. It lasted for over 30 years. In 1998, on the 30th anniversary of the tornado, the city of Charles City held a memorial service. The names of the 13 victims were read aloud. The mayor spoke about the changes that had been made since 1968. The fire chief of that day, now retired, was in the audience. He did not speak. He did not need to. The community knew the story. They knew that the fire chief had followed the rules and that the rules had failed. They did not blame him. They blamed the system. The system by then had changed beyond recognition. The National Weather Service had become a part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The Weather Bureau had been renamed. The radar network had been upgraded to Doppler in the 1990s. The Storm Spotter program had grown to over 300,000 volunteers. The siren systems across the country had been redesigned to allow remote activation from state emergency management centers. The chain had been strengthened at every link. But the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And the weakest link in many communities remains the human decision-maker. In 2003, a study commissioned by the National Weather Service examined how local emergency managers respond to tornado warnings. The study found that nearly 30% of emergency managers would wait for visual confirmation before activating sirens, even when a tornado warning had been issued by the Weather Service. The reasons were varied: fear of false alarms, pressure from local officials, a desire to avoid panic. The lesson of Charles City had been taught, but it had not been learned by everyone. In 2008, a tornado struck the town of Parkersburg, Iowa, killing 6 people. The Weather Service had issued a tornado warning 20 minutes before the tornado hit. The local emergency manager activated the sirens. Most residents took shelter, but some did not. The survivors later said that they had heard the sirens but did not believe the tornado would hit their neighborhood. They had heard sirens before, they said, and nothing had happened. The false alarm problem was real. The challenge was to balance the need for speed with the need for credibility. The National Weather Service responded by developing a new system for communicating risk. The system, called impact-based warnings, added information about the severity of the threat. A tornado warning now included whether the tornado was confirmed by radar, whether it was likely to be large, and whether it was moving toward populated areas. The goal was to help emergency managers and the public make better decisions. The goal was also to reduce the number of false alarms by being more precise about when and where the threat was greatest. Charles City by 2018 was a different place. The population had grown, but the tornado scars had faded. The city had built a new high school with a reinforced gymnasium that doubled as a storm shelter. The siren system had been upgraded with battery backups and automatic activation from the County Emergency Operations Center. The fire department no longer had a resolution requiring visual confirmation. The city council had repealed the resolution in 1969, and no one had ever proposed reinstating it. But the memory of May 15, 1968 remained. It remained in the stories that were told every spring when the first tornado watch was issued. It remained in the way the children learned to run to the basement without being told. It remained in the quiet reverence that fell over the city when the sirens were tested on the first Saturday of every month. The sirens blared not as a warning but as a reminder. The reminder was that the chain could break. The reminder was that the people who died in 1968 died because a system failed them. The reminder was that the system is only as good as the people who run it. In 2022, the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Charles City at 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. The warning was based on radar indication of a mesocyclone with a hook echo. The lead time was 22 minutes. The emergency manager activated the sirens at 3:48 p.m. The fire department was notified. The schools went into lockdown. The residents took shelter. The tornado touched down at 4:05 p.m. on the west side of town. It was an EF2 with winds of 120 miles per hour. It damaged 20 homes and overturned 2 cars. No one was killed. No one was seriously injured. The next day, the local newspaper ran a front-page article about the successful warning. The article quoted the emergency manager, who said that the system worked because everyone did their job. The article quoted the fire chief, who said that the training had paid off. The article quoted a survivor from 1968, now in her 80s, who said that she had heard the sirens and gone to the basement without hesitation. She said she had learned her lesson 60 years ago. She said she would never forget. The lesson of Charles City is not just about radar or sirens or protocols. The lesson is about the fragility of the systems we build to protect ourselves. We design them to work under normal conditions, but tornadoes are not normal conditions. They are the edge cases, the outliers, the moments when the assumptions we made in the design phase turn out to be wrong. The only way to survive those moments is to have a system that is flexible enough to adapt and people who are trained enough to make the right call. The tornado of May 15, 1968 did not destroy Charles City. It changed it. It forced a reckoning that rippled across the entire country. It forced the Weather Bureau to rethink its warning philosophy. It forced emergency managers to trust the radar. It forced communities to build shelters and practice drills. It forced survivors to live with the memory of what could have been avoided. The story of Charles City is not over. It is told every time a meteorologist sees a hook echo and issues a warning without waiting. It is told every time an emergency manager activates the sirens without hesitation. It is told every time a family huddles in a basement and hears the roar of the wind passing overhead. It is told in the silence after the storm when the sun rises over a city that is still standing and the survivors count their blessings and remember the ones who are not there. And it is told in the hope that the next time the chain will hold, because the next time the sirens will sound, the next time the warning will be heard, the next time the people will take shelter. And the next time, if the chain holds, no one will die. That is the legacy of Charles City. That is the lesson that was paid for in 13 lives. That is the lesson that cannot be forgotten.